The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. In this episode of The Deep End, we break the fourth wall tonight. Our guest is none other than Professor Marcia Langton. Marcia Langton is an anthropologist and geographer of Yiman descent from Queensland. She is one of Australia's most eminent policy advisors and public intellectuals. She has worked at the University of Melbourne since the year 2000, where she is now Associate Provost, a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies. She was co-chair of the Voice Co-Design Senior Advisory Group with Professor Tom Calma during the Morrison government. We co-host this podcast together, The Deep End with Marcia Langton and Aaron Corn, and recently co-authored the book Law the Way of the Ancestors for Thames and Hudson. Marcia, welcome to The Deep End.
Thanks, Aaron.
So, we have just completed our first season of 21 episodes leading into the Voice referendum that Australia faces this weekend, this Saturday, on the 14th of October. And we have had the absolute pleasure of talking to some amazing, gifted, talented, generous and wise people about all the reasons why they think that we should be voting yes this weekend. And there are far too many people to enumerate right here. And there are far too many favourite moments in all of those episodes for us to go over. But the one person we haven't spoken to about this matter, of course, is you. And there's one question in every episode thus far that we have asked nearly every guest who's come on this program. We have asked them, after very long and searching discussions between us, to people who are undecided about how to vote in this referendum on Saturday, what would you say to them? And so my question to you, Marcia, is that to people who are undecided about how to vote in this referendum, what would you say to those Australians?
So, this is what I say to my friends and to people who are undecided. And this is what I've learnt over many years of considering these problems. This vote on Saturday is the most important vote that each one of us will make. Many voters will never have voted in a referendum. I voted in the Republic referendum, but it's my very considered view that this vote is more important than the Republic vote. The one thing that the Republicans did not address when they went to a referendum with a question that divided the country was how the nation fits First Nations people into its fabric. This question addresses that head on. We could have a unified Australia in the future if Australians vote yes, because they will be voting yes to constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples. And that's just historical fact. Our ancestors were here more than 60 millennia ago, and everybody in my mother's line is Aboriginal and did not come from anywhere else. This is our homeland. This is where we are from, and our ancestors created this place as a wonderful series of first peoples Now, my grandmother came from southwest Queensland. She was a station cook, and she worked on the stations in southwest Queensland, and she spoke a language that sounds like Bidjara. It sounds a bit like Yuwalarai, but it also sounds a lot like the smaller languages that were gathered up into Bidjara in the 20th century as the numbers of speakers died off, and eventually everybody in the region ended up speaking Bidjara. So my people were part of that diaspora from the controlled reserves and worked on sheep stations as domestics and cooks and rural labourers. My grandfather met my grandmother on the Mitchell Reserve, and that's where they got married. And he had come from the Woorabinda Reserve. Before that, he and his people were force-marched from the old Bundalla Reserve or Taroom Reserve north to Woorabinda. So our peoples have been subjected to removals and incarceration, indentured labour, enforced labour. And I grew up in southern Queensland, and until 1984, the legislation in Queensland was plainly discriminatory, and it discriminated against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a particular way. And it was all part of the old assimilation policy to remove us as peoples from our homelands by locking up the so-called full-bloods and breeding out the so-called half-castes and quarter-castes and taking children away by various means. The controlled reserves had dormitories full of children. Some of my aunties and uncles were in those dormitories. And I know that Australia has changed a great deal since the referendum of 1967, when more than 90% of Australians believed that they were voting for equal rights for Aborigines. That was the slogan, equal rights for Aborigines. Vote yes. But the job wasn't finished. The Constitution remains discriminatory in at least one clause, Section 51(26). Section 25 is a hangover from the old White Australia policy. Australians have this opportunity to overcome that discriminatory nature of our Constitution by including us, by giving us a voice, so that our representatives can speak to the Parliament and the government to ameliorate the tendency of governments to use Section 51(26) to harm us. That section has only ever been used against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's called the race power, but it has only ever been used against us. Here's a chance to give us a say through our representatives on a voice, so that our Parliament and our government doesn't jump straight to discriminatory, harmful policies that hold us back. Why shouldn't we, the First Peoples of Australia, thrive in this country like other Australians do? We could if we were given a chance. All of the statistics tell us that we're not living as long as other Australians are. The average life expectancy gap is 8 years, but it's so much more for people in remote areas. As we know, Aaron, having lost friends recently from who live in remote areas, they die 15, 20 years younger than they should.
Well, the last one was 60.
Yes, he died at the age of 60, far too young. And we could overcome the mortality rates, the life expectancy gap, the infant mortality rates, the alarmingly high and increasing child suicide rates if we could have a say in policies. Now, one of the very evident characteristics of a part of Australia that we've seen very clearly in the referendum campaign is racism. And the outgoing Racial Discrimination Commissioner, Chin Tan, has said that we need a national anti-racism framework. It didn't have to be like this. I was a member of the referendum working group, and we met twice with Peter Dutton. So let me tell you about the referendum working group. Peter Dutton has cast us all as the Canberra elite, but then he picks us off one by one and uses our name and our reputations in various ways. So amongst the members of the referendum working group are Linda Burney, the minister, she chaired it, Senator Patrick Dodson, Senator Mullenderry McCarthy from the Northern Territory, Megan Davis, constitutional lawyer, Sally Scales, she's a young Pitjantjatjara woman, Pedro Stevens from the Torres Straits. The late Dr. Yunupingu was a member until he passed. We lost him this year as well, again well before his time. Thomas Mayo, who started out and for many years was a wharfie on the wharves of Darwin. Pat Anderson, who co-wrote the Uluru Statement from the Heart with Pat Turner, for many years, with Megan Davis. For many years, Patricia Anderson was the Chief Executive Officer of the Dilba Medical Service, the Aboriginal Controlled Medical Service in Darwin. She's now nearly 80, and she still works so hard. Peter Yu, who we interviewed, for a long time the Chief Executive Officer of the Kimberley Land Council, born and raised in Broome, and very much one of the leaders in Western Australia who's reshaped Aboriginal affairs from an end of the frontier nightmare to the possibility of viable futures for all the peoples, the Indigenous peoples in Western Australia. And so many more like that. 25 members who've worked hard all their lives. Each one of them has worked very hard and made an enormous difference. Senator Patrick Dodson was one of the commissioners on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. Professor Tom Calmer co-chaired the Senior Advisory Group of the Voice Co-Design Group. We produced 2 reports under the Morrison government. We presented them to the Minister, Ken Wyatt, who's also on the referendum working group. And both times, Peter Dutton was in Cabinet. He saw those reports. Together, they're well over 400 pages of detail, the detail that he's constantly asking for. We pointed out to him that these reports exist, and he ignores us completely. So what has happened is not only is he labelled all of these wonderful people as the Canberra elite, which is a lie because most of them do not live in Canberra. Many of them live in remote areas. So he not only tells lies like that, but he has constantly bleated about the lack of detail. The detail is there. He knows it's there. He knows that our Voice Co-Design report, the interim report and the final report will be the basis for the legislation that could follow a successful referendum. So the referendum question, it's very simple. 1, it recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples by establishing a voice. What is the voice, people say? What is the detail? In our reports, easily findable online, we recommended up to 35 regional and local councils so that local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people design their own voices with government that in a way that works for them, including their boundaries, their structures. Do they have elections? Do they incorporate traditional people, historical people in their regions because of all of the forced removals? How do they achieve gender equity? How are they inclusive of all the different kinds of people who live in their region? That is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Remembering that most Torres Strait Islanders now live on the mainland and are not represented by the Torres Strait Regional Authority. We recommended a number of people from each state or territory and included on the National Voice as well 5 additional seats for people from remote areas because of the huge disadvantages that they suffer. Now, there have been a lot of complaints about how many people Tasmania is going to get, how many people the Northern Territory is going to get, but on the National Voice. But remember, our reports are merely bodies of recommendations and explanation of how a system could work. We think it's a very good report, and all of us who served on that committee, and there were 52 of us, believe that our report makes a very good effort. You can quibble about details, but if the majority of Australians in a majority of states vote in favour of the referendum proposal, our reports would be debated in Parliament, first of all in the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee that the Prime Minister has proposed, and public submissions would be taken. There'd be consultations with the public, and people could propose improvements or another system. But I have not seen any other proposal that comes anywhere near the detail and consideration that our Voice Co-Design group gave to this model.
So, Marcia, many of our guests, starting several weeks back, including some of the constitutional legal experts we interviewed and a few of the independents, and I think yesterday Senator Patrick Dodson himself in the National Press Club, raised the emerging problem that is being wrought upon us from this referendum campaign, that the No campaign's attack on the Yes campaign is not merely about winning or losing a referendum. Some people are seeing this as a serious attack on the very fabric of our democracy. And to flesh that out slightly more for people, it's an attack on the ability of governments to govern. It's an attack on the ability of the public service to work independently. And as some of our guests have very overtly stated, it's an attack on the rights of every single Australian citizen who votes and their popular sovereignty to make an informed decision about changes to the Constitution and all the policy matters that flow through that impact the direction of our future. There's a deliberate attack to tell people to not exercise an informed decision in this referendum. And I must say that deeply worries me. Does it worry you?
Yes, well, the tragedy of the referendum campaign is that Peter Dutton, the opposition leader of the coalition parties, the Liberal Party and the National Party, declared the opposition of his side of politics to the referendum, and he knew very well that that would doom the referendum campaign to failure, because most referenda have not succeeded without bipartisan support. And I believe he did so in order to use the referendum as his climb back to get the Liberal Party more seats in Parliament by appealing to his base. But he's made, I think, and many others agree with me, a strategic mistake. His calling card throughout the referendum campaign has been, that one nation style of politics, the racism of one nation. And he thinks that by having Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine by his side, that they're a sufficient foil to the essentially nasty one nation messages of the No campaign. So we've seen throughout the No campaign a series of lies. And one is that, and he said it, he was the first to say it, that the referendum will divide Australia by race. So that is an outright lie, and every constitutional expert who's paid attention to this problem has also said that this is a falsehood, because the Constitution has had racial provisions, particularly the race power, in it since 1901. It was written and designed to be a racialist constitution, and the White Australia policy originated with the constitutional conventions, and it was almost the first legislation in the Australian Parliament. So it's not the referendum campaign or the referendum proposal, the question on constitutional recognition through the voice, that has racially divided Australia. It's the No campaign lies. So that's the first one. The other one is that we don't need a voice. We Indigenous people don't need a voice in this country. We have voices, apparently, according to the No campaign, and that by asking for a voice, should we get a voice to Parliament and executive government, we would have more rights than other Australians. Again, this is a lie. There is no way in which the voice, as it is conceived in the referendum question, could give more rights to us Indigenous people compared to other Australians. That is not possible. All that the voice would be is an advisory body. It would be designed entirely by the Parliament. It could not have a veto. It could only make representations. As the question is designed, there is no requirement for the Parliament to accept those representations or advice. And it would constitute just an advisory body to Parliament and the executive government. Thirdly, the big lie from the No campaign is that the referendum proposal is constitutionally risky. The majority, the vast majority of constitutional experts, former High Court judges, former Chief Justices of the magistrates' courts of the states and other courts have said in public statements that the referendum proposal is not constitutionally risky. It is constitutionally sound and safe. And moreover, it is elegant and practical. One of the persistent falsehoods from Peter Dutton is that the Prime Minister Albanese has not provided the detail. And, that's, the old switcheroo kind of question, because he knows very well that all the detail was worked out and went to the cabinet in which he sat under the Morrison government. Now, Albanese is not at liberty to propose the voice co-design report that Tom Calmer and I worked on, because that has to be worked out by the Parliament. So he's deceived Australians on that matter as well. And now Australians are very confused about what they're voting for. But I will remind them, you are voting simply for constitutional recognition of Indigenous people and an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament and the executive government to make representation on matters relating to us and us alone. It would give us no more rights than you have. It does not take away any rights that you have. It does not give us more than what you have. It merely gives some of our representatives an advisory role to help us overcome the terrible disadvantages that our people suffer, because for 50 years or more the policies have not been designed with us. They have been designed to be imposed on us, and they are not working. They are making our lives worse. We merely want to say through a voice constitutionally enshrined so that governments cannot take away our representative bodies on political whims at each election. It is a very safe and constitutionally sound question, and it will enrich Australia by ensuring that our country is unified on the basis of recognition of Indigenous people, so that they become one part of the Constitution of Australia. Our Constitution embeds the British institutions, and it welcomes the multicultural communities, the non-British communities that have come to our country. And so, as Noel Pearson puts it, our Commonwealth would be completed. It is a uniting document.
Marcia, it's been a great privilege to hear you speak about this tonight, and also to work with you on this podcast. I know that the work that we've done here will be very valuable into the future, but most of all, I want to thank you for everything you've done over the decades of your work, getting us to this point in history. The leadership and courage that you show every day that we turn up to work together, and for your wisdom, and finally your friendship. And I really hope that everything goes well for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.